Hi, folks. Tonight we travel back over 1,000 years to a cold and merciless time when being captured by Viking raiders was not just a terrifying moment, it was the start of an entirely new, brutal existence. Tonight, you become a Viking slave. You're standing at the edge of your small coastal village, watching helplessly as longships slice through the mist, their curved prows adorned with dragon heads, oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Your heart pounds, but there's nowhere to run. The warriors leap ashore, axes glinting, shields raised. Shouts fill the air, and before you can even cry out for help, rough hands grab your arms and drag you toward the shore. You're shoved into the belly of a longship, the planks beneath, your feet slick with seawater, and something else you don't want to identify. Your wrists are bound with coarse rope that bites into your skin every time you try to shift your weight. Around you, others from your village huddle in stunned silence, some quietly weeping, others already resigned. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and check if you are subscribed to the channel, because several viewers of the channel are complaining that YouTube is removing their subscriptions, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The ship pushes off, the rhythmic creak of oars lulling you into a dazed state. The salty spray stings your eyes as the warriors roar their chants over the waves. Historians generally agree that Viking raids across Europe in the 8th to 11th centuries often targeted vulnerable coastal communities for slaves, who were considered highly valuable commodities. Your captors are already calculating how much silver you might fetch at the next market. The air below deck is stifling. The ship's low ceiling forces you into a crouch, and the rough-hewn beams scrape at your back with every lurch of the vessel. You're not alone. Dozens of others are crammed into the dark space, some wounded, some ill, all terrified. Above you, the warriors feast on dried fish and ale, laughing boisterously as they recount the day's plunder. Below, you gag on the thick smell of sweat, salt, and fear. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking slaves, known as thralls, were considered legal property and could be bought, sold, or even sacrificed. In some Norse sagas, slaves are mentioned as part of a chieftain's wealth, counted alongside livestock and weapons. Your value now lies not in who you are, but in what you can be exchanged for. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how uniformly brutal the experience of Viking slavery was. Some historians argue that certain slaves, particularly those with specialized skills like metalworking or weaving, might be treated better or even integrated into the household. Others emphasize that, for most, life as a thrall meant relentless labor, physical abuse, and perpetual vulnerability. As the longship cuts through the cold, gray waters of the North Sea, you huddle deeper into yourself, trying to remember the last time you felt safe. You can't even see land anymore, only the horizon, flat, endless, indifferent. The rhythmic splash of the oars fades as exhaustion pulls at your body. You know instinctively that this is just the beginning. The days ahead will be harder, colder, and far more painful than you can yet imagine. The days blur together as you remain chained below deck, the constant pitch and roll of the longship making it impossible to find rest. Every muscle in your body aches from the awkward position you've been forced into. Your wrists chafed raw from the coarse rope, your legs cramped and numb. Above you, the Viking warriors shout orders and sing their rough sea songs, their voices muffled by the thick timber overhead but still carrying the unmistakable tone of triumph. Occasionally, a hatch above creaks open, letting in a beam of cold, salty light and a bucket of stale water or a scrap of hard bread tossed down to the captives. You scramble for it, fighting off another prisoner whose hunger has made them reckless. The two of you glare at each other, teeth bared. But you both know the truth. There's barely enough to survive. Historians generally agree that captured slaves on Viking longships were subjected to appalling conditions during transport. Chained or roped together, they were crammed into spaces designed for cargo, not people, forced to endure days or even weeks at sea with little food, no sanitation, and constant exposure to the elements. The longship itself, though marvelously engineered for speed and maneuverability, was a brutal place to be a prisoner. The floorboards beneath you are slick with seawater and filth. With every wave that crashes over the sides of the vessel, cold brine seeps down through the cracks and soaks your already drenched clothes. You shiver uncontrollably, teeth chattering, unable to move enough to generate warmth. Around you, other captives groan in pain or sob quietly, their despair mixing with the ever-present creak of the timbers and the splash of oars. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking longships were so shallow and flexible that they could navigate rivers and shallow coasts with ease, often allowing raiders to strike deep inland where victims least expected it. This meant that captives like you weren't just taken from seaside villages, but sometimes from settlements far upriver, places that never imagined they could be vulnerable to seaborne attack. The longship that now imprisons you might have traveled hundreds of miles across open sea and winding rivers before you ever set foot in it. But there's still an open, scholarly debate about the exact treatment of slaves during these voyages. Some historians argue that captives were so valuable as trade commodities that Viking raiders took care to keep them alive and relatively healthy, providing at least basic sustenance. Others contend that the captives' suffering was immense, with death rates during transport high due to disease, exposure, and neglect. The lack of written accounts from the slaves themselves makes it difficult to know for certain. Above deck, the warriors cheer as the coastline comes into view, jagged cliffs and dark pine forests looming out of the mist. You strain to see, but the angle is impossible. You're left only with the knowledge that you're approaching land, and with it, whatever new horrors await. When the ship finally runs aground on a pebbled beach, the warriors drop the gangplank and begin unloading their loot. Chests of silver, barrels of grain, livestock, and finally, the human cargo. You are dragged roughly up onto the deck, blinking against the sudden gray light. Your legs so weak from disuse that you nearly collapse. The warriors laugh as you stumble, one of them giving you a hard shove in the back with the butt of a spear. You fall to your knees in the icy surf, gasping at the shock of the cold water against your skin. Around you, other captives struggle to their feet, their eyes darting wildly as they take in this new landscape. Historians generally agree that Viking raids were meticulously planned operations with targeted destinations and strategic objectives. Slaves were a primary motive, both for domestic labor and for sale in the thriving trade networks that stretched from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and beyond. The demand for human cargo was immense, and your captors see you as just another asset in that market. Your wrists are unbound, but only long enough for heavier iron shackles to be clamped around your ankles. These are connected by a short chain that makes walking difficult and running impossible. The warriors form a rough perimeter around you and the other captives as they march you up the rocky path from the beach toward a settlement you can just barely make out through the mist. Longhouses with thatched roofs, smoke rising steadily from their chimneys, and people, women, children, elders, standing at the edge of the village, watching the returning raiders with a mixture of pride and curiosity. One of the villagers, a woman in a fur-trimmed cloak, approaches and examines you like livestock, prodding at your arms, lifting your chin, checking your teeth. You pull away instinctively, only to receive a sharp slap across the face from one of the warriors. Here's where it truly sinks in. You're no longer a person, at least not in the way you once understood it. You are a commodity, a resource to be used, traded, or discarded at the whim of your new masters. Historians still discuss the varied roles that slaves occupied in Viking society. Some thralls worked in households, tending to chores or caring for livestock. Others toiled in fields, in workshops, or aboard ships. A select few, particularly those with unique skills, could even find a degree of trust and responsibility within their new households, though always with the shadow of their enslaved status hanging over them. But for you, there's no such hope yet. You are led with the others into a fenced enclosure near the edge of the village, where you're forced to sit on the damp ground under the watchful eyes of armed guards. The sun, such as it is, disappears behind thick clouds, and a fine, freezing drizzle begins to fall. As night sets in, the warriors celebrate their successful raid with song and drink, their boisterous voices carrying through the still, cold air. You, on the other hand, are left shivering in your chains, your stomach growling with hunger, your mind racing with fear about what tomorrow will bring. So, next time you complain about an uncomfortable plane ride or a crowded subway, remember this. Chained in the hold of a Viking longship, soaked, starved, and terrified, you probably wouldn't have lasted a day. The morning air is damp and cold as you're jolted awake by the sharp prod of a spear tip against your ribs. You scramble to your feet, your ankles protesting against the iron shackles that have already rubbed your skin raw. Around you, other captives do the same, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. The Viking warriors bark orders in a language you barely understand, their tone enough to make you comply without hesitation. You're marched through the muddy lanes of the settlement, past rows of longhouses with their steeply pitched roofs, smoke rising steadily from each. Villagers pause in their morning chores to watch the procession of new slaves, some with curiosity, others with indifference. A child throws a clump of dirt at one of the captives, laughing as it strikes him in The chest, no one stops him. Historians generally agree that Viking settlements often functioned as hubs for both domestic life and trade, including the buying and selling of slaves. Archaeological evidence from places like Hedeby and Burka shows that these bustling towns hosted markets where goods from across Europe and beyond were exchanged, slaves among them. You are about to become part of that economy. You are led to a central square where a makeshift auction is already in progress. A raised wooden platform stands at one end, and on it, a fellow captive is being paraded before a crowd of potential buyers. A burly man with a long beard lifts the captive's arm to display his muscle tone, then shoves him to his knees to demonstrate his obedience. The crowd murmurs in approval, and a series of shouted bids ensue. Moments later, the captive is led away by his new owner, a length of rope tied around his neck. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking slave auctions sometimes included the practice of setting a starting price by placing silver coins directly on the slave's body, often on the chest or thigh, creating both a literal and symbolic association between human flesh and monetary value. The practice emphasized that in this world, your worth was calculated not by who you were, but by what others were willing to pay. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how formalized these auctions were. Some historians argue that Viking slave markets followed set procedures, with standardized prices and legal protections for buyers and sellers, if not for the slaves themselves. Others suggest that sales were often more informal and opportunistic, conducted in open marketplaces or even on the spot during raids. Your turn comes soon enough. You're yanked roughly onto the platform, blinking against the overcast daylight as the crowd scrutinizes you. A man with weathered hands and a wolf fur cloak steps forward, prodding your shoulders and inspecting your teeth as though you were a horse at market. You flinch, but don't resist. Resistance would only make things worse. The auctioneer, a warrior with a thick red beard and a booming voice, calls out prices in the local dialect, his tone growing more animated as the bidding escalates. You catch the occasional word: strong, young, worth, but most of it is incomprehensible noise. Finally, the man in the wolf fur cloak raises his hand, signaling his final bid. The auctioneer slaps him on the shoulder with a grin, and just like that, the transaction is complete. A thick leather collar is buckled around your neck, and a new rope leash is tied to it. Your wrists remain free for now, but only because escape is impossible. Historians generally agree that slaves in Viking society could be traded multiple times, their ownership changing based on economic need, political alliances, or personal whim. You may be this man's property today, but there's no guarantee you'll remain so for long. You're led away from the market, down a winding path that skirts the edge of the village and into the surrounding countryside. Your new owner walks briskly, barely glancing back to ensure you're following. The leash jerks painfully whenever you fall behind. As the village recedes into the distance, you take in the landscape. Rolling hills blanketed in moss and lichen, dense stands of pine and birch, and in the far distance, the glint of water, perhaps a fjord or another river that feeds into the sea. The air here smells of wet earth and smoke, with a faint metallic tang from the blacksmith's forge still lingering in your nostrils. After an hour's walk, you arrive at a modest homestead, a timber longhouse surrounded by pens of livestock, stacks of firewood, and rows of tilled earth ready for planting. This, you realize, is your new prison, a place where your labor will fuel someone else's prosperity. Historians still discuss the role of slaves in sustaining Viking rural economies, while some thralls served in households or as craftsmen. Many were put to work on farms, performing the grueling labor necessary to maintain self-sufficiency in the harsh Nordic environment. Your fate, it seems, will be no different. Your new owner unties the leash and gives you a shove toward a low structure adjacent to the main house, a shed or perhaps a byre for animals. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of straw and manure. A thin blanket is tossed into a corner, and you understand at once. This is where you'll sleep. As night falls, you sit on the damp straw, knees drawn to your chest, listening to the distant sounds of the longhouse, laughter, the clatter of wooden bowls, the occasional burst of song. None of it is meant for you. So, next time you feel uncomfortable in a cramped airplane seat or a crowded bus, remember this: standing on an auction block in a Viking market, stripped of your freedom and dignity, with your future sold to the highest bidder, you probably wouldn't last a day. The rooster's crow pierces the pre-dawn darkness, but you're already awake, if you ever truly slept at all. The thin blanket did little to shield you from the night's chill, and your body aches from the hard-packed earth beneath the straw. Before you can even gather your thoughts, the door to the shed creaks open, and your new owner's silhouette fills the frame. He barks something sharp in his native tongue, and though you don't understand the words, the meaning is unmistakable. Get up. You stumble to your feet, your muscles stiff and protesting, as he hands you a rough wooden bucket. He gestures toward a low stone wall, enclosing a pen where several goats are already stirring, bleeding softly in the early light. It's clear. Your first task is to muck out the pen, hauling out the soiled straw and replacing it with fresh bedding. Historians generally agree that Viking thralls were put to work immediately upon arrival, often with little or no instruction, left to figure out the tasks through observation or harsh correction. The labor was relentless, tending livestock, fetching water, chopping wood, hauling stones, repairing fences, all essential to the survival of the household, but punishing in its physical demands. You trudge toward the pen, the iron shackles around your ankles clanking with every step, a constant reminder of your new status. The cold morning air cuts through your thin tunic as you set to work, shoveling out the damp, reeking straw while the goats jostle around you. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Viking thralls, particularly those assigned to farm work, were expected to live among the animals, sleeping in the same pens they cleaned by day. This wasn't considered cruelty, it was simply efficient. Shelter was scarce, and the warmth of livestock was better than freezing to death alone. But there's still an open scholarly debate about the daily conditions and treatment of Viking slaves. Some historians argue that because slaves represented an economic investment, many owners avoided excessive cruelty that might diminish their productivity or lead to rebellion. Others emphasize that violence and coercion were inherent to the system, ensuring obedience through fear. By mid-morning, your hands are blistered from gripping the worn wooden handle of the pitchfork. The smell of manure clings to your skin, and your back screams from the unfamiliar exertion. But there's no respite. Your owner gestures for you to follow him to the nearby woods, where fallen branches and dead trees must be gathered for firewood. You trudge behind him, carrying an axe that feels far too heavy for your exhausted arms. The forest is dense and quiet, save for the occasional rustle of birds or the distant bark of a hunting dog. Sunlight filters through the canopy in thin, pale ribbons, offering little warmth. As you chop at a stubborn log, your owner watches from a distance, sharpening his sayax, a short Viking knife, on a whetstone. The sound of steel against stone is slow and deliberate, a chilling accompaniment to your labor. Historians generally agree that rural Viking life, for both free and enslaved people, revolved around subsistence tasks like this. Even free farmers endured backbreaking work to survive the short, growing seasons and long, brutal winters. For thralls like you, however, there was no end in sight, no land of your own to cultivate, no family to share the burden, no hope of advancement. By midday, your arms feel like lead, and your stomach twists with hunger. You've had nothing to eat since a scrap of stale bread the night before, and now your owner tosses you another meager portion, a heel of coarse rye and a strip of dried fish so tough you have to gnaw at it like an animal. Here's the thing about Viking cuisine. It wasn't all mead halls and feasting. For most people, especially slaves, daily sustenance was plain and functional. Bread, porridge, dried fish, root vegetables. If you're lucky, you might get some buttermilk. If you're not, you go hungry. Historians still argue about the role of diet in the health and longevity of Viking thralls. Some suggest that, despite their grueling labor, slaves benefited from the same basic diet as their owners, keeping them strong enough to work. Others argue that malnutrition and chronic illness were rampant, with slaves often relegated to the poorest cuts of meat or leftovers unfit for the free members of the household. The afternoon brings yet another task, repairing a section of the homestead's boundary fence, damaged by recent storms. You drag thick wooden posts through the mud, digging holes with a spade, while your owner stands nearby, offering no assistance, but plenty of shouted instructions. The hours drag on, each task bleeding into the next. There's no concept of a workday here, no set hours or mandated breaks. The sun governs your time, and until it sets, you are in motion. By the time dusk approaches, your body is spent. Your hands are raw, your shoulders aching, your legs barely supporting your weight. You glance longingly at the longhouse, where you know your owner and his family are now gathered around a warm hearth, enjoying a hearty supper of stew and ale. You, however, are led back to the shed, where a bowl of thin gruel awaits, a gray, tasteless paste that does little to replenish the energy spent in the day's toil. You eat mechanically, every spoonful reminding you of how far you've fallen from your former life. Historians still discuss the psychological toll of enslavement in Viking society. While sagas and historical records often emphasize the physical labor of thralls, the emotional and mental strain, the loss of identity, autonomy, and hope is less documented, but no less profound. As night falls, you lie once again on the cold straw, your body too exhausted to shiver, your mind too numb to dream. You know that tomorrow will be the same as today, perhaps even worse, and that there is no foreseeable end to this cycle. So, next time you complain about your early morning alarm or a tough shift at work, think of this: rising before dawn in a Viking homestead, laboring from sunup to sundown, without rest, sustenance, or reward. You probably wouldn't last a day. The rooster crows again, though you barely registered the difference between night and day. Your muscles ache as you sit up from your makeshift bed of straw, brushing away bits of dirt clinging to your tunic. There's no time to stretch or gather yourself. Your owner stands in the doorway already, gesturing sharply for you to follow. You shuffle outside into the crisp morning air, the cold biting at your skin through the thin fabric. This morning's task is one you've grown to dread. Mucking out the byre where the livestock sleep, the longhouse looms nearby, its warm interior barred to you. Instead, you spend the first hours of dawn ankle deep in a mixture of mud, straw, and manure, your bare hands blistered and cracked from hauling heavy forks of filth out to the midden heap. Historians generally agree that Viking thralls often lived and worked in close quarters with animals, not out of cruelty, but practicality. Their labor was essential to managing livestock, ensuring the household's survival. Yet, for the thralls themselves, this work was dehumanizing. Sleeping near the animals they tended, treated as property much like them. You can barely breathe through the stench, but you work quickly, knowing from yesterday's experience that lingering will only earn you a cuff to the head or a sharp kick. The goats bleat and jostle around you, unconcerned with your discomfort. Over by the pen, your owner's daughter tosses scraps to the pigs, giving you a glance that is neither friendly nor cruel, simply indifferent. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Viking households housed their livestock inside the same longhouse where the family lived, separated only by a low wall. This helped keep the animals safe from predators and provided additional warmth during the harsh Scandinavian winters. For a thrall like you, however, it meant that your sleeping space was indistinguishable from that of the animals. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how much personal space or dignity Viking slaves were afforded within these arrangements. Some historians argue that long-term household thralls might form closer bonds with their masters, earning slightly better conditions or even the trust of the family. Others suggest that thralls were consistently marginalized, kept at arm's length socially, and confined physically to the least desirable parts of the household. After the pens are cleaned, you are handed a yoke, a heavy wooden beam fitted across your shoulders with 2 dangling buckets. Your next task: fetch water from the nearby stream. The journey is long and treacherous, especially with the yoke digging painfully into your collarbones and the iron ankle shackles making each step a struggle. As you approach the stream, you notice another thrall already there, an older man with hollow cheeks and sun-creased skin. filling his buckets in stoic silence. You exchange a glance, but no words. You don't share a language, and even if you did, there's nothing to say. Both of you know that the only thing you share is your suffering. Historians generally agree that the Viking world was multi-ethnic and cosmopolitan, with slaves captured from across Europe, Anglo-Saxons, Slavs, Celts, even other Scandinavians. For many, language barriers compounded their isolation, rendering even basic communication impossible and deepening their sense of alienation. You kneel at the stream's edge, cupping some of the icy water in your hands to rinse the dirt from your face. But there's no time to linger. You fill the buckets, hoist the yoke onto your shoulders with a grimace, and begin the slow march back to the homestead, water sloshing with every uneven step. Upon your return, your owner is repairing a section of the fence that encloses the sheep. Without a word, he gestures for you to assist, handing you a crude mallet and a pile of wooden stakes. You set to work, driving the stakes into the frozen earth while he watches, his eyes narrowing each time you falter or pause to catch your breath. Here's your quirky tidbit. Archaeological findings suggest that Viking homesteads were often fortified with wooden fences or earthen ramparts, not only to keep livestock contained, but to protect against raiders or wild animals. Thralls were frequently tasked with maintaining these defenses, performing back-breaking labor that demanded both strength and endurance. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether this kind of labor offered thralls any degree of status within the household. Some scholars suggest that those who proved particularly skilled, at carpentry for instance, might be entrusted with more complex tasks and gain a modicum of respect. Others argue that no matter how skilled a thrall was, they remained fundamentally property, their labor extracted without recognition or reward. By midday, your stomach is a hollow ache, but there's no sign of a meal. The owner and his family sit at the longhouse entrance, eating from wooden bowls while you stand by, awaiting your next order. Eventually, a scrap of cold porridge is tossed your way, barely enough to take the edge off your hunger, but sufficient to keep you working. You swallow it quickly and return to the task at hand, hauling more firewood from the forest. This time, you're accompanied by one of the owner's sons, a boy, perhaps half your age, but already taller and stronger. He carries an axe with the casual ease of someone who has never known fear of his own mortality, unlike you, whose entire existence now revolves around it. As you chop and stack the wood, your hands blister and bleed, but you grit your teeth and keep going. You've learned by now that any sign of weakness is met with disdain at best and violence at worst. Historians still argue about the prevalence and severity of punishment within Viking slaveholding households. Some evidence suggests that thralls who disobeyed or attempted escape faced brutal consequences, from whipping to execution. Others point to sagas describing more complex relationships between masters and slaves, including instances of affection, loyalty, and even eventual manumission. By the time the sun dips below the horizon, you are so exhausted that you barely notice the bruises and cuts accumulated over the course of the day. Your body moves on instinct alone as you stow the last of the firewood and stagger back toward the shed that serves as your sleeping quarters. The family retreats into the longhouse, their laughter and music carrying faintly through the cold evening air. You sit alone in the dark, the straw beneath you still damp from last night, your hands resting on your knees as you stare at the wall, too weary even to sleep. So, next time you complain about having to take out the trash or mow the lawn, remember this: rising before dawn to clean livestock pens, haul water, chop wood, and endure constant physical and emotional strain. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The morning mist clings low to the ground as you shuffle toward the feeding trough, your empty stomach gnawing at you like a second set of chains. A cracked wooden bowl is thrust into your hands. Inside, a watery mixture of barley and turnip, cold and congealed. It's your breakfast, if you can call it that. You sit on an upturned log, the frost biting through your thin tunic, and begin to eat mechanically, each spoonful doing little to quell the ache inside. You glance toward the longhouse, where your master's family is already seated by the hearth, their laughter drifting through the gaps in the timber walls as they feast on warm porridge, smoked fish, and honey-sweetened bread. Historians generally agree that the diet of Viking thralls was meager at best, while free members of the household enjoyed a varied diet rich in protein and dairy. Slaves subsisted on scraps, coarse bread, thin gruel, and the occasional root vegetable. Malnutrition was common, leaving thralls weakened and more susceptible to illness. You force down the last bite of cold gruel just as your owner barks an order from across the yard. Without hesitation, you set down your bowl and rise to your feet. Today's task is familiar by now: tending to the livestock. The pigs root noisily in their pen as you toss them buckets of scraps. One of the larger sows lunges toward you aggressively, and you stumble backward, barely avoiding her snapping jaws. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking pigs were known to be particularly hardy and aggressive, a valuable but dangerous part of farm life. Thralls were expected to manage these animals with minimal equipment and no regard for their own safety, often suffering bites, trampling, or worse. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how systematically owners provided for their thralls' well-being. Some historians argue that slaves were seen as economic assets, making their preservation a pragmatic concern. Others contend that neglect and even deliberate deprivation were common, as owners could always acquire more slaves through raids or trade. After feeding the pigs, you move to the chicken coop, gathering eggs with numb fingers and scattering grain across the ground. The hens cluck indignantly as you disturb them. Overhead, dark clouds gather, promising yet another day of cold, drizzling rain. By late morning, the weather turns. A fine, freezing mist settles over the homestead, and your thin clothing does little to protect you. Your master orders you to chop firewood for the hearth, knowing full well that you'll be working in soaked garments. The axe feels heavier. With each swing, your hands raw and blistered beneath the rough grip. Historians generally agree that the relentless nature of this labor, combined with poor clothing and inadequate nutrition, left thralls vulnerable to respiratory illnesses, joint problems, and chronic fatigue. Without access to medical care or rest, these conditions often became debilitating. Your shoulders burn as you drag the last of the chopped wood to the storage pile. You barely have time to catch your breath before you're handed another task, helping to mend the roof of the byre before the next storm. Climbing onto the slippery thatch, you steady yourself as your owner tosses up bundles of reeds. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking thatch roofs required frequent maintenance, especially in the wet, cold climate of Scandinavia. Thralls were often responsible for this dangerous task, working high above the ground without safety equipment, risking falls and injury for the sake of their master's livestock. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how specialized this labor was. Some scholars suggest that experienced slaves might develop skills in thatching, carpentry, or blacksmithing, making them more valuable and perhaps slightly better treated. Others argue that most thralls were used as general laborers. Regardless of skill or aptitude, the rain intensifies as you work, soaking you to the bone. Your fingers grow numb, and your footing becomes increasingly precarious. Suddenly, your foot slips on the slick thatch, and you tumble several feet before landing hard on the muddy ground below. Pain shoots through your ankle, but your owner barely glances your way, muttering something under his breath as he moves on to supervise another task. You limp back to the shed, clutching your side, but there's no question of resting. Injury doesn't excuse you from your duties. It simply makes them harder. You're sent to gather more firewood from the forest, each step through the muddy trail sending jolts of pain up your leg. Historians still argue about the extent to which injured thralls were cared for by their owners. Some evidence suggests that slaves who could no longer work were simply left to fend for themselves, or even cast out. Others point to sagas in which injured or elderly thralls were given basic care, if only to prolong their usefulness. By evening, you return to the shed, your body battered and your spirit worn thin. A small bowl of cold porridge awaits you, no different from your morning meal, but now even less appetizing after a day of relentless labor in the cold and wet. As you settle onto the damp straw, you hear the faint sounds of music and laughter from the longhouse, where the family feasts and drinks by the fire. For them, the day's work is over, and the night is a time for rest and celebration. For you, the night is simply another stretch of hours to survive until the next day of toil. So, next time you complain about leftovers or doing chores in the rain, think of this: soaked, hungry, injured, and utterly powerless as a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The cold seeps into your bones as you rise stiffly from the straw, your body protesting every movement. The previous day's injury hasn't healed. If anything, the swelling around your ankle has worsened. But there is no question of rest. Your master expects you to work, and so you will. Today's task begins before sunrise, dragging heavy stones to reinforce the homestead's boundary wall. Your owner points to a collapsed section of the low stone fence and gestures for you to begin, hauling boulders from the nearby field. The rocks are slick with moss and frost, each one heavier than the last, and your injured ankle threatens to buckle with every step. Historians generally agree that Viking thralls were responsible for some of the harshest physical labor, including building and maintaining the structures essential for the farm's survival. Stone walls, fences, and even sections of longhouses were erected and repaired by slaves, often with little more than basic tools and brute strength. You wince as you hoist another stone onto your shoulder, gritting your teeth against the pain. There's no time to bandage your ankle or even rest for a moment. The master stands nearby, arms folded, watching closely. A sharp glance from him is all it takes to remind you of what happens if you falter. Here's your quirky tidbit. Norse laws allowed for slaves to be punished severely for perceived laziness or disobedience. One particularly feared punishment was the ear cutting, a permanent mutilation marking a thrall as disobedient. While rare, such acts served as public warnings to others considering resistance. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how consistently such punishments were enforced. Some historians argue that most Viking households maintained discipline through routine violence, while others suggest that, especially in smaller or isolated farms, pragmatic concerns, like the need to maintain a reliable labor force, tempered the harshest penalties. After hours of hauling and stacking stones, your hands are raw and bloodied. The simple act of closing your fingers around the rough surface sends jolts of pain up your arms. But the wall is rebuilt now, a crude testament to your suffering and labor. You are given no time to admire or even acknowledge your work. Without pause, you're handed a coarse hemp rope and directed toward the river. One of the livestock pens needs a new water source, and that means drawing buckets of icy water up the steep riverbank and hauling them back to the homestead. You trudge through the woods, the path muddy and treacherous from recent rains. The birds above call to one another, oblivious to your misery. When you finally reach the river, the water rushes fast and cold, its surface broken by jagged rocks. Kneeling at the bank, you fill the first bucket, the icy water numbing your hands. Instantly, the climb back is worse than you imagined. The full bucket swings with each unsteady step, sending water sloshing onto your already soaked clothing. By the time you reach the pen, more than half the water has spilled out, and you're ordered to go back for more. Historians generally agree that tasks like water hauling were essential and unceasing. Without plumbing, every drop of water needed for livestock, cooking, cleaning, or brewing had to be carried by hand, often over long distances. For thralls, these repetitive, physically punishing chores defined daily existence. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Norse farms built rudimentary wooden aqueducts to divert water from nearby streams directly into pens or fields, reducing the need for manual hauling. But such conveniences were rare, usually reserved for larger estates. For most slaves, the bucket remained their eternal burden. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how much technological ingenuity was applied to ease the burden of labor on farms. Some historians emphasize Viking innovation in areas like shipbuilding and metallurgy, while others argue that when it came to slave labor, efficiency was often less important than exploitation. After hours of hauling water, you're ordered to assist with shearing the sheep. You kneel beside the restless animals, wielding dull shears that tear through their thick wool in uneven patches. The sheep bleat in protest, kicking and wriggling as you work, their hooves occasionally connecting with your already bruised body. The wool will be spun and woven into garments for the household, but you know you'll never wear anything finer than the coarse, patched tunic you've been given. Your hands, now cut and raw from the shears, ache with every movement. Historians still debate the roles thralls played in Viking textile production. While most wool processing was carried out by free women of the household, slaves often handled the more labor-intensive aspects, washing, carding, and spinning the raw fleece into yarn, then weaving it on vertical looms. By late afternoon, you're sent to the forest once more, this time to gather kindling and mushrooms. The woods are thick and quiet. The only sounds your labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. As you collect small branches, you spot a patch of mushrooms beneath a fallen log. You pause, uncertain. Some are safe, edible, even desirable. Others are deadly, but you haven't been taught the difference, and there's no one here to ask. You gather them anyway, knowing that a mistake could cost your life, or worse, earn you a beating for bringing back something useless. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking Age Norsemen had extensive knowledge of local flora and fungi using mushrooms in cooking, medicine, and even rituals. Some evidence suggests that certain hallucinogenic mushrooms were used by berserkers before battle to induce frenzied states. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how much of this botanical knowledge was shared with or accessible to thralls. Some suggest that household slaves, especially those involved in cooking or foraging, learned by necessity and accumulated expertise over time. Others argue that such knowledge was often withheld, maintaining the thralls' dependence on their masters. You return to the homestead, arms laden with kindling and your foraged bounty. The master inspects your haul, grunting in approval at the wood, but saying nothing about the mushrooms. He waves you off to stack the firewood, and you do, so mechanically, your energy nearly spent. As darkness falls, you slump against the side of the shed, too exhausted to even enter. The stars emerge one by one above the homestead, their cold light indifferent to your suffering. So, next time you sigh about having to carry groceries up a flight of stairs, think of this: hauling stones, buckets of water, and firewood from dawn till dusk, your body breaking under the weight of endless, thankless labor. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The morning mist hangs thick over the homestead as you're jolted awake, not by the rooster's crow this time, but by the acrid smell of burning. The smoke seeps through the cracks of your shed's walls, clinging to your tattered tunic and filling your lungs before you even sit up. You scramble outside, only to find that today is not for the usual grueling farm labor. Today, you are being summoned to the forge. Your master gestures curtly, a hammer slung over his shoulder, and you follow without question. The forge is located at the edge of the property, a squat, soot-blackened building with a low thatched roof and walls slick with centuries of smoke. As you approach, the heat radiates outward, a stifling, oppressive wave that smothers you even before you cross the threshold. Historians generally agree that thralls were often conscripted for metalworking tasks, particularly the most dangerous and labor-intensive ones, pumping the bellows, hauling ore, carrying charcoal. Skilled blacksmiths may have maintained their freedom and status, but for slaves, the forge was yet another site of exhaustion and peril. Your master doesn't need to explain what you're here for. You've seen enough in your short time to know. He points to the bellows and then to the pile of wood that must be carried from outside to keep the forge's fire alive. Without hesitation, you set to work, dragging bundles of split logs toward the maw of the furnace, your body already drenched in sweat despite the morning chill. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking forges were capable of producing high-quality iron tools, weapons, and even fine jewelry. But the process was arduous. The bellows alone required hours of constant operation to maintain the heat necessary for smelting and shaping metal, a task often delegated to thralls, who would pump tirelessly while the smith worked. But there's still an open, scholarly debate about the extent to which slaves were trained in metalworking skills beyond the most menial tasks. Some historians argue that certain thralls, particularly those with pre-existing skills, were allowed or even encouraged to develop expertise that increased their value. Others suggest that the majority of thralls served merely as expendable labor with little to no opportunity for advancement or training. You grip the wooden handles of the bellows and begin to pump, the repetitive motion quickly turning your arms to jelly. The forge's fire roars to life, embers swirling upward in chaotic bursts of orange and white. Your skin prickles with the heat, and soot clings to every inch of your exposed flesh. Each pull of the bellows sends a fresh gust of air into the furnace, intensifying the inferno within. Above the flames, your master heats a strip of iron, hammering it against the anvil with rhythmic precision. The clang of metal on metal reverberates through the confined space, drowning out every other sound. You flinch with each strike, your ears ringing and your head pounding from the relentless noise. Historians generally agree that smithing was a highly respected craft in Viking society, often associated with magical or supernatural properties. The blacksmith was sometimes viewed as a figure of great power, capable of transforming raw materials into weapons of war or tools for survival. But for you, as a thrall, this process is stripped of any mysticism. It's just another day of grueling, dangerous work. After hours at the bellows, your hands are blistered, your shoulders locked in a permanent ache. Your master finally sets down his hammer, inspects the half-finished tool, and mutters something you don't understand. Without ceremony, he points to the pile of slag, waste material from the smelting process, that needs to be carried outside. You grab a crude shovel and begin the filthy task, heaving heavy, jagged chunks of slag into a wheelbarrow and trundling it out behind the forge to the refuse heap. The air outside is marginally cooler, but your lungs burn from inhaling smoke and ash all morning. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some archaeological digs have uncovered large slag heaps near Viking settlements, indicating prolonged and intensive metalworking activity. These refuse piles serve as a grim testament to the countless hours of labor, much of it performed by slaves, that fueled the Viking economy and warfare. But there's still an open, scholarly debate about whether thralls assigned to forges fared better or worse than those in agricultural labor. Some argue that working in a forge, while dangerous, kept slaves out of the harshest elements and provided opportunities to acquire valuable skills. Others contend that the risks of burns, respiratory illness, and long-term injury made the forge one of the most hazardous assignments for any thrall. By late afternoon, your master orders you to assist with the transport of finished tools to a neighboring farm. He loads a cart with freshly forged axes, scythes, and nails, and ties the harness to an ox. You are ordered to walk alongside the cart, ensuring nothing shifts or falls as the ox trudges through the rutted forest path. The journey is long and silent, save for the occasional groan of the cart's wooden wheels and the rustling of the wind through the trees. Your legs, already weak from the morning's labor, threaten to give out with every uneven step. Upon arrival, the neighboring farmer inspects the goods, exchanges a sack of grain and a few silver coins with your master, and offers you nothing more than a cursory glance before disappearing into his longhouse. Historians still discuss the ways in which Viking thralls were instrumental in facilitating not just subsistence labor, but also trade and economic exchange. Slaves were often responsible for transporting goods, managing livestock, and performing the heavy labor that underpinned these transactions. You turn back toward your master, expecting perhaps a moment to rest before the return journey. Instead, he gestures sharply, back on the road, back to the forge, back to the bellows. As twilight descends, you return to the homestead, your entire body aching, your skin streaked with soot and sweat. There's no warm bath or clean clothes waiting for you, just a bowl of thin gruel and the familiar, damp corner of the shed where you will collapse, only to wake and do it all over again tomorrow. So, next time you complain about your job or the monotony of your daily routine, think of this: 12 hours at the bellows, hauling slag, inhaling toxic fumes, and enduring relentless labor without pause or purpose beyond your master's gain. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The cold is unrelenting as you wake to another gray morning, your muscles still screaming from yesterday's endless hours in the forge. But there's no time to recover. Today, your master assigns you yet another task: gathering peat from the bogs. It's a filthy, back-breaking job, but essential. Without peat, the hearth would go cold, and in the Viking world, a cold hearth is a death sentence. You trudge toward the edge of the property, past the longhouse and the animal pens, toward the low-lying marsh where the earth turns spongy and dark. The bog stretches out in all directions, a bleak, silent landscape dotted with scrubby plants and the occasional skeletal tree. You know from the stories whispered among the other thralls that more than peat is buried out here. Some say these bogs have claimed countless lives. Historians generally agree that peat was a critical fuel source for Viking settlements, particularly in areas where wood was scarce. Cutting and hauling peat was arduous work, often relegated to slaves who spent hours waist-deep in freezing, stinking water, slicing through dense turf with crude iron spades. You plunge the spade into the sodden earth, each cut sending up a sickly, sweet smell of decay. With every heave, the water seeps into your already damp boots, chilling your feet to the bone. The peat bricks are heavy, dense with moisture, and you stack them carefully on a sled that you'll later drag back to the homestead. Here's your quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found remarkably well-preserved bodies in Scandinavian and Northern European bogs, so-called bog bodies, whose skin and even stomach contents remain intact after centuries due to the unique chemical makeup of the peat. Some of these bodies belonged to sacrificial victims, but others may have been slaves who met their end in the very same landscape where you now work. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how often bogs were used as sites of punishment or sacrifice. Some historians believe that these bodies represent ritual killings intended to appease the gods or mark territorial boundaries. Others argue that such cases were rare and that most Viking thralls met more mundane, if no less brutal, ends through overwork and neglect. By midday, the sled is piled high with sodden peat bricks, and your arms feel as though they might detach from your shoulders. Your master waves you back toward the homestead, and you begin the long, agonizing haul, the sled dragging heavily across the uneven ground. Back at the longhouse, you unload the peat into a covered storage pit, stacking it carefully so it can dry out over the coming weeks. Only then will it be light enough to burn efficiently, providing warmth through the long, dark months ahead. Your reward for this morning's labor? A crust of stale bread and a cup of sour whey, barely enough to keep your strength from flagging entirely. Historians still debate the nutritional status of Viking thralls. Some argue that slaves were kept adequately fed to ensure their labor could continue, while others suggest that chronic undernourishment left many thralls in a constant state of exhaustion and ill health. The afternoon brings no reprieve. Your master orders you to accompany him into the forest to fell timber for the construction of a new outbuilding. You follow him along a narrow, winding path through the pines, the undergrowth clawing at your legs, and the heavy axe slung across, your back weighing you down with every step. At the chosen site, you set to work felling trees. Swinging the axe requires every ounce of strength you have left, and soon your palms are blistered and raw, your shoulders burning with the effort. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking settlers were adept at managing their woodland resources, often employing rotational felling to ensure a sustainable supply of timber for shipbuilding, construction, and fuel. But for thralls like you, forestry work was dangerous and relentless, with little concern given to safety or rest. But there's still an open scholarly debate about the degree of ecological knowledge possessed by Viking societies. Some historians point to evidence of sustainable practices and sophisticated woodland management, while others argue that overexploitation of resources, fueled by the constant demands of expansion and trade, led to deforestation and ecological strain. By the time the sun begins to set, you've felled and trimmed several large trees, their trunks now lashed together and ready to be dragged back to the homestead by oxen. Your master dismisses you with a grunt, and you stagger back through the darkening forest, your legs barely able to support your weight. As you approach the shed that serves as your sleeping quarters, you catch sight of the longhouse, warm light spilling from its narrow windows, the laughter and music of your master's family drifting out into the cold night air. You, however, collapse onto your damp straw bed, every bone in your body aching, your stomach gnawing with hunger. There will be no feast for you, no songs, no fire to warm your frozen hands, only the bitter knowledge that tomorrow will bring more of the same. So, next time you groan about having to do yard work or carry groceries, think of this: knee deep in freezing bogs, hauling sodden peat, felling ancient trees with raw hands, and collapsing into a dark, cold shed after another day of ceaseless labor. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The sound of distant thunder rumbles across the hills as you drag yourself from the damp straw, your joints stiff from yesterday's relentless toil in the bogs and forest. But your body no longer protests in surprise. It has resigned itself to this rhythm of exhaustion. Another day dawns, cold and gray, and with it comes a new demand: tending the fishing nets down by the fjord. Your master hands you a woven basket and a coiled net, gesturing sharply toward the water's edge. The path to the fjord is slick with rain, and your bare feet slip on the smooth stones as you make your way down, each step sending shivers through your already numbed limbs. The mist hangs thick over the water, blurring the horizon and cloaking the shore in a veil of cold silence. Historians generally agree that fishing was a vital supplement to the Viking diet, providing a reliable source of protein, especially during long winters when hunting and farming became less feasible. Thralls were often sent to maintain the nets, gather shellfish, and haul in catches, their labor supporting both daily sustenance and trade. Reaching the fjord, you wade into the icy shallows, teeth clenched as the cold bites into your skin. You begin the painstaking task of repairing the fishing nets, untangling knots, patching frayed sections, and anchoring them securely to the rocks. The work is slow, requiring both strength and precision, and the water quickly saps your energy. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking fishing nets were commonly made from hand-spun flax or hemp and required constant maintenance to remain effective. Archaeological finds have revealed intricate stone net weights and wooden floats used by Norse fishers to optimize their catches. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether slaves were routinely involved in sea-based activities like fishing and rowing longships. Some historians argue that these tasks required skill and thus were typically handled by free men, while others contend that the sheer labor demands of maintaining a Viking household necessitated the use of thralls in all aspects of survival, including maritime work. After hours spent knee-deep in freezing water, your fingers are nearly useless from the cold, and the coarse fibers of the net have cut into your palms. Your master approaches, holding out a woven creel, and orders you to gather mussels from the tidal rocks nearby. You scramble over the slick stones, careful not to lose your footing as waves crash against the shore. The mussels cling stubbornly to the rocks, and you pry them loose, one by one, dropping them into the creel until it grows heavy with your harvest. By the time you finish, the tide has begun to rise, and your master calls you back to the shore. Without pause, you are ordered to carry the heavy creel up the slippery path, back toward the homestead. Your legs burn with each step, and more than once you slip, the weight of the basket nearly dragging you to your knees. Historians generally agree that the burden of transporting heavy loads, be it firewood, water, peat, or food, fell primarily on the shoulders of thralls. The sheer physical strain of this constant hauling eroded their health, leaving them prone to chronic injuries and early death. Upon returning to the homestead, you deposit the muscles by the hearth, where your masters, wife, and daughters begin to prepare them for the evening meal. You're given none of the cooked catch, of course. Instead, your master tosses you a crust of dry bread and gestures for you to return to the fields. Here's your quirky tidbit. Mussels and other shellfish were a common feature of coastal Viking diets, often boiled into stews or roasted over open flames. Yet, despite gathering these delicacies, thralls typically subsisted on the simplest fare: barley porridge, flatbread, and whatever scraps remained after the household was fed. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether thralls could supplement their meager rations through foraging or fishing for themselves. Some suggest that slaves might have been permitted to gather wild berries or snare small game in their limited free time, while others argue that any such activity would have been closely monitored or prohibited outright to prevent escape or unsanctioned subsistence. The afternoon brings another demand: harvesting hay from the meadow before the next storm arrives. You join a line of other thralls, scythes in hand, sweeping them rhythmically through the tall grass. The sun, hidden behind thick clouds, offers little warmth, and soon your hands blister from gripping the rough wooden handle. The cut hay must then be gathered into heavy bundles, hoisted onto your back, and carried to the barn for storage. Each trip leaves you more drained, your legs wobbling beneath the load, your breathing ragged with fatigue. Historians generally agree that haymaking was one of the most labor-intensive tasks in Viking agriculture, essential for ensuring the livestock's survival through the long, barren winters. Thralls were responsible for much of this grueling work, performing it alongside other seasonal chores, without respite. By dusk, the meadow is cleared, and the barn is filled with the fragrant, scratchy bundles of dried grass. Your master claps his hands together in satisfaction, then waves you off dismissively. No thanks, no praise, only the silent expectation that you will be ready to do it all again tomorrow. As night falls, you return to your shed, dragging your sore, battered body onto the damp straw. Through the thin walls, you can hear the sounds of the household gathered around the hearth, sharing food, stories, and laughter. For them, life is hard, but free. For you, it is merely survival, day after endless day. So, next time you sigh about a cold walk to the store or grumble about yard work, think of this: wading through freezing fjord waters, harvesting mussels with frozen fingers, hauling baskets up slippery slopes, and cutting hay until your body collapses from exhaustion. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The dawn mist clings to the earth as you shuffle out of the shed, your breath emerging in pale clouds against the icy air. Before your body even has the chance to ache, before your stomach remembers its hunger, your master is already barking orders, this time with a sharpness that sets your nerves on edge. Today is different. Today, You'll accompany him beyond the homestead into the nearby village where trade is bustling and the stakes are higher. You grab your cloak, a ragged thing that does little to keep out the cold, and follow him down the winding path toward the settlement. Your role here is clear: carry the goods, load the carts, and above all, keep quiet. There are consequences for speaking out of turn. As you've learned all too well, historians generally agree that Viking thralls were frequently used in trade, expeditions, tasked with hauling goods between settlements, manning booths, or even tending animals brought to market. While some might imagine that proximity to trade offered slaves a glimpse of freedom, for most, it only underscored the harsh reality of their status as property, moving from place to place, always under the watchful eyes of their masters. Your master's ox-drawn cart is heavy with bundles of wool, cured hides, and iron tools forged in the same suffocating forge where you spent countless hours. The road is uneven and muddy, each rut threatening to topple the cart or snap the brittle wheels. It is your job to steady the load, pushing your shoulder against the frame whenever it lurches too far to one side. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking towns like Hedeby and Birka were not just centers of commerce, but melting pots where people from Scandinavia, the Baltic, and even the Islamic Caliphate crossed paths. Archaeological finds reveal coins from Baghdad, silk from Byzantium, and amber from the Baltic, products carried in part by slaves like you, whose labor made such vast networks possible. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how visible or invisible thralls were within these markets. Some scholars argue that slaves blended into the backdrop, performing their tasks quietly under the command of their owners. Others suggest that their very presence, as living, moving commodities, was a constant, visceral reminder of the brutal human trade that underpinned much of the Viking economy. As you approach the village, the sounds of commerce grow louder: the lowing of cattle, the hammering of metal on anvils, and the sharp calls of traders hawking their wares. The air is thick with the scent of smoked fish, leather, and sweat. Everywhere, people bustle about, free men and women negotiating prices, merchants unloading ships, children darting between stalls. You, however, have no business here. Beyond labor, your master orders you to unload the cart's contents onto a rough wooden stall at the market's edge. With practiced movements, you hoist each bundle of wool, each stack of hides, placing them precisely where instructed. Historians generally agree that Viking slaves were indispensable to the logistics of trade, performing the heavy lifting and tedious tasks that kept markets running. And while some slaves may have gained specialized knowledge, such as bartering or assessing the quality of goods, most were relegated to pure muscle. As you finish unloading, your master hands you a rope tethered to 2 goats, indicating that you are now responsible for holding them steady while he negotiates their sale. The animals tug and bleat, straining against the rope as you dig your heels into the mud to keep control. Here's your quirky tidbit. Livestock was among the most valuable forms of wealth in Viking society, used not just for food, but also as currency in legal settlements and dowries. Thralls were often tasked with managing these valuable animals during market days, ensuring they remained healthy and presentable to potential buyers. But there's still an open, scholarly debate about whether slaves could themselves participate in market transactions, perhaps selling surplus produce or crafts in their limited free time. Some sources hint at the possibility of slaves saving up for their own eventual manumission, while others depict thralls as entirely excluded from economic agency. The negotiations stretch on for what feels like hours. You stand there in the freezing wind, the coarse rope digging into your hands as the goats stubbornly resist your control. Finally, the sale is completed. Your master pockets a small pouch of silver coins, slaps you on the shoulder to signal the job's done, and gestures for you to reload the cart with new supplies purchased from the market. Among these are barrels of salted fish, sacks of grain, and a bundle of rough-spun wool. The cart is even heavier now than before, and as you push it out of the village, your legs tremble under the strain. Historians still argue about the degree of mobility Viking thralls experienced. Some suggest that slaves confined to farms led more isolated lives, while those attached to merchants or craftsmen might travel extensively across towns, regions, even continents, but always under guard, always as property. As you trudge back along the muddy road, the sun begins to set behind the dense pine forests, casting long, cold shadows across the path. Your hands blister, your feet numb from hours of standing, and your shoulders ache from the endless lifting and carrying. By the time you return to the homestead, your master is already counting his earnings by the fire while you are ordered to unload the cart one final time before retreating to the shed. There's no warm meal waiting for you, only the usual bowl of gruel, now cold and congealed from sitting out all day. So, next time you grumble about running errands or carrying groceries up the stairs, think of this: hauling carts loaded with goods across miles of rugged terrain, standing in the freezing wind for hours without food, and managing livestock you don't own, all while knowing that your labor enriches someone else entirely. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The rain begins as little more than a mist, but by the time you're roused from your cramped sleep, it has become a steady, chilling downpour. The mud outside your shed is thick and treacherous, and your thin shoes do little to keep it from seeping between your toes, numbing your feet before the day's work even begins. Your master gestures toward the boathouse at the edge of the property, a weather-beaten structure crouched beside the fjord where the family's longship is moored. Today, you will be helping with ship maintenance. It is dangerous, back-breaking work that you have heard whispered about in grim tones from other thralls. Historians generally agree that Viking longships required constant upkeep, waterproofing the hull with tar, replacing damaged planks, mending sails, and checking rigging. While free men often commanded and sailed these vessels, it was slaves who carried out much of the tedious, perilous maintenance. You trudge after your master, your hands already aching in anticipation of the tasks ahead. The longship looms ahead, its carved dragon prow a grim reminder of the raiding voyages it has already seen, and the ones it will embark on again soon. Its hull rests partially in the water, slick with algae and cold to the touch. Your first task is to help haul the vessel further onto the shore for inspection. Ropes are tied around wooden rollers placed beneath the keel, and with a shouted command, you and a group of other thralls lean your shoulders into the hull, pushing with every ounce of strength you can summon. The ship groans and shifts forward, inch by agonizing inch, as rain beats down on your back and the mud pulls at your feet. You slip more than once, your knees slamming into the sharp rocks hidden beneath the muck. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking ships were often coated with a mixture of pine tar and animal fat to protect the wood from rot and seawater. Applying this mixture was messy, noxious work, typically relegated to thralls, who endured the choking fumes and the filth without complaint. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether slave labor in ship maintenance extended to more skilled carpentry tasks. Some historians argue that only trained shipwrights handled structural repairs, while others suggest that thralls, through sheer necessity and repetition, acquired the practical skills needed for basic fixes and could be pressed into service for nearly any task. Once the ship is pulled far enough onto the shore, your master hands you a bucket of the foul-smelling tar and a rough brush made from bundled reeds. Without needing instructions, you set to work slathering the hull, your hands soon sticky with the pungent substance. The fumes burn your nostrils, making your head swim as you try to keep pace with the other workers. Historians generally agree that working with tar posed significant health risks, from respiratory ailments to skin irritation and long-term toxicity. But for thralls, these risks were not a concern. The goal was simple: complete the job or face punishment. After hours of brushing, your arms are leaden, your eyes watering from the fumes. You pause to catch your breath, but a sharp bark from your master sends you back to work immediately. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking longships were constructed with remarkable precision, using a technique known as clinker building, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets. This made the ships fast, flexible, and durable, but also meant that maintenance was frequent and labor-intensive, especially after long sea voyages. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how much access thralls had to the construction process itself. Some scholars suggest that only free men with specialized knowledge worked in the shipyards, while others argue that thralls were indispensable laborers in every stage, from tree felling to final assembly. With the hull finally sealed, your master orders you to assist in mending the sail. You climb onto the deck, slippery with rain, and help unroll the heavy woolen cloth. It is torn in several places from the last voyage and must be stitched by hand with thick flax thread. Your fingers are clumsy from fatigue and cold as you work the needle through the sodden fabric. The wind tugs at the sail, threatening to pull it from your grasp as you struggle to keep the material steady. By the time the repairs are complete, you are soaked through, your hands raw from the rough fabric and the constant friction of the coarse thread. The other thralls are similarly spent, their faces hollow and pale beneath their sodden hoods. Historians still discuss the complexity of Viking maritime culture and the essential role of slave labor within it. While the raiders and warriors garner most of the attention in sagas and popular imagination, The reality is that behind every voyage lay countless hours of preparation and maintenance, much of it performed by people like you, with no glory, no recognition, and no choice. As the light fades from the sky, your master finally signals an end to the day's labor. You stagger back toward the shed, your clothes stiff with tar, and your muscles aching from the strain of moving a ship by hand. There is no bath to wash away the filth, no change of clothes, and certainly no comfort, just the cold straw, the ever-present hunger, and the knowledge that tomorrow the ship may need more work, or worse, it may sail, and you may be forced to go with it. So, next time you complain about doing car maintenance in the rain or patching a leaky roof, think of this: dragging a massive Viking longship onto shore, smearing it with tar by hand, and mending its torn sail in the freezing wind, all while knowing that you are as replaceable as the planks beneath your feet. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. You wake to a chill deeper than before, your body wrapped not only in rags, but also the lingering stiffness from hauling and repairing the longship. The cold has seeped into your very bones, and your hands, still coated with remnants of tar, crack and split as you flex your fingers. But today's task offers no reprieve for sore muscles. Your master summons you to the fields. The low sun barely peeks over the horizon as you trudge behind him, following a narrow trail past the animal pens and into the plowed land where rows of withering turnips and barley stalks still cling stubbornly to the earth. The harvest season is short in these northern latitudes, and every able body is needed to gather what remains before frost claims it all. Historians generally agree that agricultural labor formed the backbone of Viking society. While free men and women worked their own plots, thralls provided essential manpower, especially during peak seasons like planting and harvest. Without their relentless labor, Viking households would not have endured the long, harsh winters. Your master points toward a row of turnips and hands you a crude digging tool fashioned from a bent iron spike lashed to a wooden handle. Without a word, you kneel in the damp soil and begin loosening each bulb from the cold earth, tossing them into a woven basket by your side. Here's your quirky tidbit. Turnips were a staple crop in Viking agriculture, along with barley, oats, and cabbage. Root vegetables like these were especially prized because they could be stored through the winter months in underground pits, providing essential nutrition when hunting and fishing were impossible. But there's still an open scholarly debate about the extent to which Viking thralls had any autonomy over their agricultural labor. Some historians argue that skilled slaves may have been entrusted with managing fields or overseeing livestock, while others insist that thralls were generally kept under tight control, assigned only the most menial and physically demanding tasks. The sun climbs higher as you work, though it provides little warmth. Your knees sink deeper into the muck with each movement, and the coarse fabric of your trousers chafes against your skin until it is raw. The basket beside you fills slowly, each turnip coated with dark clumps of soil. When your master deems the basket full, he gestures for you to carry it back to the homestead's storage cellar. You heave the heavy load onto your shoulder, staggering along the uneven ground. as the weight digs into your bruised collarbone. At the cellar, a low, timber-framed structure sunk partially into the earth, you set the basket down and begin stacking the turnips in neat rows alongside other harvest stores, sacks of grain, crates of apples, barrels of salted fish. The cellar is cool and musty, its air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Historians generally agree that Viking households relied on such storage methods to survive the winter months. The labor of preparing and organizing these supplies fell largely to thralls, whose familiarity with the stores ensured that they were maintained, inventoried, and replenished as needed. After a brief, unsatisfying mouthful of stale bread, you're sent back to the fields, this time to cut what remains of the barley stalks. With a sickle dulled by years of use, you bend and slice through the brittle stems, gathering them into bundles to be threshed later in the season. Here's your quirky tidbit. Barley was the essential grain in Viking society, not just for bread, but also for brewing ale, which was a safer and more caloric drink than water. Thralls like you often assisted in the brewing process as well, though they rarely, if ever, tasted the finished product. But there's still an open scholarly debate about the extent to which thralls partook in the fruits of their own labor. Some scholars suggest that occasional indulgences or allowances were made for hard-working slaves, particularly during festivals. Others argue that such generosity was rare, with most slaves existing on the bare minimum necessary to sustain their productivity. As the day wears on, your hands develop new blisters from gripping the sickle, and your back aches from hours hunched over the fields. The wind picks up, sending gusts of frigid air across the barren land, and you clutch your thin tunic closer around your shoulders. Though it does little to shield you from the cold, your master checks your progress periodically, grunting in disapproval if your pace slackens. There is no encouragement, no thanks, only the unspoken understanding that failure means punishment, and perseverance merely means survival. By dusk, the fields are cleared, and the harvested bundles are stacked neatly at the edge of the property, ready to be carried to the barn. You are sent to retrieve them, one by one, each trip sapping what little strength you have left after a day of unrelenting labor. Historians still discuss how Viking thralls managed to endure such ceaseless work day after day, season after season. Some point to the rigid social hierarchy and the ever-present threat of violence as the mechanisms that ensured compliance. Others suggest that, over time, thralls simply internalized their status, their hopes for freedom dulled by years of subjugation. The time you collapse onto the cold straw of your shed that night, your body is spent beyond words. Your fingernails are caked with dirt, your clothes stiff with sweat and soil, and your stomach hollow with a hunger that will never truly be satisfied. The sounds of your master's family feasting reach your ears faintly through the cold night air, laughter, the clinking of mugs, the warm crackle of the hearth. For them, the harvest is cause for celebration. For you, it is just another day survived. So, next time you sigh about raking leaves or complain about yard work, think of this: hours spent stooped over in freezing fields, pulling stubborn roots from the earth, hauling heavy loads to the cellar, and collapsing in exhaustion only to rise and do it all again tomorrow. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The first frost of the season coats the ground in a thin, glittering layer as you force your aching body upright. The cold bites through your tunic before you've even left the shed, stiffening your fingers and toes, tightening your muscles before the day's labor has even begun. Your master is already outside, dressed in heavier woolens and furs, preparing the oxen for the day's work. He motions you over without so much as a greeting and points toward a wooden yoke lying nearby. Today, you will assist in plowing the far field, a task as punishing as it is necessary. Historians generally agree that plowing was an essential agricultural task in Viking society, especially in preparing the land before the earth froze completely. While free men often handled the oxen and guided the plow, it was typically thralls who walked alongside, clearing rocks, ensuring the furrows stayed true, and doing much of the physical grunt work required to make the process efficient. You approach the oxen cautiously, knowing well their strength and stubbornness. The yoke is already affixed, and your master cracks the whip to set them into motion. You walk beside the plow, pulling stones and clumps of grass from the soil with numb fingers, the freezing earth clinging to your hands like iron shackles. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking plows, known as ARD plows, were simple but effective tools for breaking through the thin topsoil of Scandinavia's rocky terrain. They required constant adjustment and vigilance to prevent the blade from getting stuck. Another job often left to the slaves, but there's still an open, scholarly debate about how much skill thralls were permitted or required to develop in tasks like plowing. Some historians suggest that over time, long-serving slaves became indispensable for their expertise, while others argue that thralls were deliberately kept ignorant to prevent them from gaining too much autonomy or influence within the household. As you work your way down the length of the field, your boots slip repeatedly in the frost-covered mud, and your arms throb from hauling stones aside. The oxen move at a plodding but relentless pace, dragging the plow through soil that resists every inch of progress. By midday, your clothes are soaked from the melting frost, and your own sweat clinging uncomfortably to your body and offering no insulation from the biting wind. Your master hands you a crust of bread and a small flask of sour ale, barely enough sustenance to keep you moving, and then signals for you to resume work. Historians generally agree that Viking thralls were given just enough food to sustain their labor, with little consideration for comfort or nutrition. Malnutrition, compounded by overwork and exposure to the elements, meant that many thralls lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion and ill health. After hours of wrestling with the stubborn earth, the field is finally plowed, the furrows stretching in neat, straight rows across the landscape. But there's no time for rest. Your master next orders you to gather firewood from the nearby forest, as the cold weather demands ever more fuel to keep the longhouse warm. You set off down the well-worn trail with a rough-hewn axe slung over your shoulder, your legs barely supporting your weight after the morning's labor. The forest is quiet, but foreboding, its bare branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Here's your quirky tidbit. Norse mythology revered certain trees, especially the mighty ash, believed to be Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting all realms. Yet, despite these sacred associations, the practical demands of survival meant that trees were felled regularly for firewood, construction, and shipbuilding. For thralls, the forest was not a place of mythic wonder, but yet another site of labor. But there's still an open scholarly debate about how much access slaves had to the religious or cultural narratives of their owners. Some historians posit that slaves absorbed the household's beliefs and rituals, while others suggest that thralls, especially those captured from foreign lands, remained culturally isolated and excluded from such traditions. You swing the axe again and again, your shoulders screaming in protest as you split logs into manageable pieces. Once you've gathered enough wood to fill your arms, you begin the arduous walk back to the homestead, the bundle pressing painfully against your chest with every step. By the time you return, dusk has already fallen, and your master gestures for you to stack the firewood neatly outside the longhouse. The family is gathered within, their laughter and warmth bleeding faintly through the timber walls. You, on the other hand, are dismissed to your shed with nothing more than the usual bowl of cold gruel waiting for you in the corner. You eat slowly, mechanically, your mind as numb as your fingers. Historians still discuss the mental toll that such relentless labor and isolation took on Viking thralls, deprived of autonomy, subjected to constant physical strain, and excluded from the social and cultural life of the household. Many slaves likely endured not only bodily exhaustion, but also profound psychological distress. As you lay back on the damp straw, staring up at the rough-hewn beams overhead, you know that tomorrow will bring the same: freezing air, endless toil, meager sustenance, and no hope of reprieve. So, next time you find yourself reluctant to shovel snow or chop firewood on a cold winter's day, think of this: rising before dawn to plow frozen fields, wrestle stones from the earth, and gather firewood with frozen hands, all for someone else's comfort and survival. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The frost has thickened overnight, layering every surface with a brittle, crystalline sheen. As you emerge from the shed, your breath hangs in the frigid air, and the ground crunches beneath your worn boots. But the beauty of the scene is lost on you. Today, you've been summoned for one of the most dangerous and exhausting tasks of all: repairing the livestock pen's stone wall that runs along the icy riverbank. Your master stands nearby, inspecting the section where spring floods had washed away part of the foundation months ago. Now, before the river freezes completely, the wall must be rebuilt to keep the animals safely enclosed, and it is you, of course, who will haul the stones. Historians generally agree that construction and repair of boundary walls and fences was an essential, ongoing task in Viking homesteads. Such barriers not only managed livestock, but also protected valuable land from encroachment and erosion. Thralls like you bore the brunt of this labor, often moving stones heavier than their own bodies, without the aid of advanced tools. Your master points to a pile of rocks gathered earlier in the season. The river's edge is treacherous, coated with slick moss and fringed by patches of thin ice. Carefully, you select the first stone, a slab nearly the size of your torso. and hoist it onto your shoulder, your entire body straining under its weight. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Viking walls, known as dikes, were so skillfully constructed from dry stacked stones that they endured for centuries. Archaeological remnants of such structures still crisscross parts of Scandinavia, silent monuments to the labor of countless anonymous workers, many of them slaves. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether thralls were permitted to take pride in their craftsmanship or if such emotional investment was discouraged. Some scholars argue that skilled labor, even under coercion, could foster a sense of mastery and identity among thralls, while others contend that the constant threat of punishment stripped all meaning from their work. You stagger toward the riverbank, the stone pressing cruelly against your spine with each lurching step. The icy wind cuts across your face, and your fingers, numb and stiff, struggle to maintain their grip. With a final groan, you drop the stone into place, atop the growing wall. But there's no time to rest. Your master motions for you to return, for another, and then another, until hours have passed in a haze of relentless exertion, the repeated shocks of cold and strain leaving your muscles trembling uncontrollably. The river swells nearby, its surface dark and fast-moving. One misstep, one slip on the frost-slick rocks, and you could be swept away. But such dangers scarcely register anymore. The rhythm of labor drowns out all else. Historians generally agree that thralls' safety was of minimal concern to their owners. Injuries from such hazardous labor were common, and a slave rendered useless by injury or accident was often viewed as an unfortunate but acceptable loss. After hauling the final stone, your task shifts to packing earth and sod into the gaps between the rocks, sealing the wall against the encroaching water. You kneel in the freezing mud, your bare hands clawing at the half-frozen soil, your nails caked with dirt, your joints stiff and swollen. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some Norse settlements, thralls were also responsible for building flood defenses, embankments of soil and timber designed to prevent river overflow from devastating farmlands. These were large-scale communal projects that required days, sometimes weeks, of coordinated labor, often with slaves working under the direction of free landowners. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether slaves in such contexts experienced any form of solidarity or mutual aid among themselves. Some suggest that shared hardship fostered bonds between thralls, forming sub-communities within their oppressive conditions. Others argue that the constant surveillance and competition for limited resources kept slaves isolated and distrustful. By late afternoon, your clothes are soaked through from kneeling in the icy muck, your limbs barely responding to your commands. Yet your master simply grunts in approval at the finished wall and gestures for you to follow him back to the homestead. There, you are handed a worn cloth and ordered to scrub down the livestock pens. A final indignity after a day of back-breaking labor. You kneel once again, scraping frozen dung and hay from the wooden planks while the animals watch with indifferent eyes. Historians still debate whether such endless cycles of physical exertion left space for any interior life among Viking thralls. Were they able to dream, to hope, to contemplate their fates? Or did the sheer monotony and brutality of their existence reduce all thought to the next task, the next command, the next moment of survival? As darkness descends and a pale moon rises above the frosted hills, you return to your shed. Your hands are raw and bleeding, your back twisted in knots, your mind numb with exhaustion. You curl up on the cold straw, your body too worn even to shiver. So, next time you dread carrying heavy groceries or shoveling snow from the driveway, think of this: hours spent hauling boulders by hand, rebuilding a crumbling wall on an icy riverbank, and scrubbing animal filth until your skin breaks, all with no reward, no respite, and no recognition. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day. The morning frost is thicker than ever, crusting over the muddy paths and stiffening the ropes that bind the livestock. You rise slowly from your pallet of damp straw, every joint groaning in protest. But there is no leniency for aching limbs. Today, you've been summoned for yet another task that will push you beyond exhaustion, accompanying your master on a hunting expedition deep into the forest. Your master waits near the edge of the homestead, outfitted in thick furs, a bow slung over his back, and a quiver full of iron-tipped arrows at his side. He gestures for you to carry the heavy sack of supplies, a bundle that includes extra rope, an iron pot, and the tools necessary to butcher whatever prey the hunt yields. Historians generally agree that thralls were frequently used as porters and assistants on hunts, carrying the gear, processing the game, and sometimes even flushing prey from hiding. While the hunt itself may have held symbolic and cultural significance for the free men who partook, for the slaves, it was simply another form of labor. You set off behind your master, the pack digging into your shoulders with every step as you move along a narrow, frozen trail, weaving through dense pine and birch trees. The forest is quiet, save for the occasional caw of a distant crow or the rustling of a rabbit in the underbrush. Your feet slip more than once on patches of ice hidden beneath the fallen leaves, but you steady yourself and press on. Here's your quirky tidbit. Viking hunts weren't just for food. They were also vital for acquiring hides, bones, and antlers, materials essential for clothing, tools, and trade. While the act of hunting could be a rite of passage for free men, for thralls, it was yet another grueling task, performed in silence and without glory. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether thralls were permitted to hunt on their own, either to supplement their meager rations or to develop skills that might improve their status. Some historians suggest that, particularly in more isolated homesteads, slaves were entrusted with trapping small game. Others argue that allowing slaves access to weapons and hunting grounds was considered too great a risk. The trail grows steeper as you ascend a rocky ridge, your breath coming in harsh, visible puffs against the freezing air. Your master walks several paces ahead, scanning the forest for signs of deer or wild boar. Occasionally, he stoops to examine a track in the snow or to inspect a broken branch. At one such moment, he crouches low, gesturing for you to drop the pack quietly. Ahead, through the tangle of trees, you spot movement. A red stag, its impressive antlers branching like the limbs of the very trees that surround it. Your master draws his bow, knocking an arrow with practiced ease. You watch as he exhales slowly and releases the string. The arrow whistles through the cold air, striking the stag cleanly behind the shoulder. The beast bolts briefly, then crashes to the forest floor with a heavy, final sigh. Without waiting for instruction, you shoulder the pack once more and follow your master to the fallen animal. He inspects the kill, then gestures for you to begin the butchering process. Your fingers are stiff from cold and exhaustion as you draw the knife across the stag's thick hide, peeling it away in heavy, wet strips. Historians generally agree that thralls were responsible for much of the post-hunt processing, skinning the animal, cutting the meat into transportable portions, and carrying the heavy carcass back to the homestead. For the master, the hunt was an act of prowess. For the slave, it was an exercise in endurance. Here's your quirky tidbit. Norse hunters often carried portable iron cauldrons on their expeditions to prepare meals directly in the field. After hours of skinning and butchering, you assist your master in setting up a small fire and boiling a portion of the fresh venison in the iron pot you carried. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether thralls shared in the spoils of the hunt. Some sources suggest that slaves were given the offal and less desirable cuts of meat, while others propose that they received nothing more than their standard rations, regardless of their contribution. After the briefest of meals, your master takes the lion's share of the cooked venison. You are ordered to lash the remaining meat, hide, and antlers into a crude sled fashioned from the stoutest branches you carried. The two of you begin the long, grueling trek back to the homestead, dragging the laden sled across the frozen ground. Each step feels heavier than the last. Your muscles, already worn thin from weeks of relentless labor, strain under the combined weight of the sled and the uneven terrain. The rope burns against your palms, and more than once you stumble, your knees slamming into the ice-crusted earth. Historians generally agree that thralls who accompanied their masters on such expeditions faced an increased risk of injury and exposure. The elements, the strain, and the ever-present possibility of accidents made hunting one of the more perilous tasks for Viking slaves. By the time you break through the tree line and the homestead comes into view, dusk has fallen and the cold has deepened. Your master orders you to carry the bundles of meat to the storage cellar, where they will be salted and preserved for the winter months. You stagger beneath the load, your back screaming in protest as you descend into the dim, earthen space. Here's your quirky tidbit. Vikings relied heavily on preservation techniques like salting, smoking, and drying to sustain them through the long winters when fresh game was scarce. Thralls often managed these processes, ensuring that the household's provisions remained viable. But there's still an open scholarly debate about whether thralls ever found moments of solace or satisfaction in their work. Perhaps in the quiet of the forest, the pride of a well-constructed wall, or the simple joy of a fire after a successful hunt. Some historians argue that such human experiences were universal, transcending status. Others maintain that the system of slavery was so dehumanizing that it left little room for anything beyond mere survival. After storing the meat, you are dismissed without so much as a nod of acknowledgement. You limp back to the shed, your body nearly collapsing under its own weight. The moon hangs cold and distant in the night sky as you curl once more onto the damp straw, the acrid smell of blood and sweat clinging to your skin. So, next time you sigh about carrying groceries from the car or complain about a weekend hike, think of this: trudging through frozen forests, dragging a bloodied sled of venison, skinning a stag with frozen hands, and returning home only to collapse in exhaustion, knowing tomorrow holds only more labor. As a Viking slave, you probably wouldn't last a day.